So I guess we should probably go ahead and get started. Um, so welcome everybody. I'm really happy to see so many faces here tonight. My name is Greg Dixon. I am the section chair of the Pacific Northwest section. My background is in audio education and composition and sound design. And I'm really happy to see so many people that I know tonight, but also so many people who I don't know. And one of the things that I think is truly exciting about these online meetings is that it feels like we're growing and developing an extended family outside of the Pacific Northwest. So I want to welcome everybody here that is joining us from all over the world, all over the United States. We really appreciate you being here. We have a really exciting meeting planned for you tonight. We've invited Tom Fine to speak this evening about the Mercury Living Presence series of recordings. And we're very excited to welcome Tom here tonight to be able to talk about these excellent recordings with you. Before we begin, just a couple announcements about current news with this section. Next month, we will be taking the month off for the holidays and kind of regrouping and planning. But we're working on developing an exciting schedule for 2021. And to that end, we'd like to include you as a part of that as well. So if you have ideas, or if maybe you've got a presentation that you think that we might be interested in, I'd encourage you to suggest that to us. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave my email in the chat. So if people have an idea, maybe you have something that you'd like to present, feel free to send me an email and let's talk about ideas for 2021, because we are still in the process of developing our schedule for next year. I'll put my email here in the chat. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you want to just talk about the meetings, or just say hello. If you've got ideas for 2021, let me know. At this point in time, I'd like to extend the microphone over to Dan Mortensen, one of our committee members, to talk about an event that he hosts every Saturday. So Dan, take it away.
Great, thanks Greg, and thanks everybody for joining us. We do this thing every Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m. Seattle time, and whatever time that is, wherever you are, where we informally get together and somebody presents something that they're interested in connected to audio. And we've had violin acoustics. We've had a discussion about the Seattle Pops Festival that Bob Gudgel mentioned before, and he has a picture of the PA there next to him, and a bunch of other subjects. Gordon's done a bunch on the Isle of Wight festivals and Hill Audio, and others as well. And we've had recently Bill Hanley joining us for the last 2 weeks, and he seems to have a good time. He was the guy who did the sound for Woodstock most famously, but a bunch of other things too that got him in the position where he could do the sound for Woodstock. And he is happy to share with us his experiences there. And we look at pictures and get him to talk about them and stuff like that. And you're totally welcome to come. If you want to, you can either send me your email in the chat here, and you can send private things. So if you click on the To Everyone button in the chat and find my name, you can send that to me personally, and I'll send you an invitation, the Zoom link for it. We don't have an Eventbrite for that anymore. And I wanted to say that if you want to come and ask Bill questions, you're certainly welcome to do that. You should avoid questions like, Bill, what was it like being at Woodstock? because he's a little tired of that particular question. But if you want to talk about microphones or whatever, you can do that. And we've already kind of actually talked about microphones, and we've talked so far about the stage and the speakers, and we're going to move on to microphones and console, such as it was, and stuff like that. So feel free to join us. We get into it, and it goes for quite a while. But I have to throw everybody out at the end of it, which is the damnedest thing. It's people want to keep talking, and that's really fun. So next Saturday, every Saturday, it's going to be. So thank you. Oh, and I wanted to say also that if you go to the little 3 dots down in the chat window to the right of the 2 and the file, you can select that the chat gets saved onto your computer. So everything that's in the chat will be saved for you if you do that. And that's a good way to keep track of stuff if you want.
So Dan, how does one access your meeting?
You send me your email and I send you a Zoom link.
Okay.
That's the access. Go ahead.
Say that again about the chat. I was having trouble even copying it. So
okay, go to the open up the chat window, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. It's like a thought bubble with chat, or a text bubble with chat.
I've got that. Sometimes okay. I can copy that, and sometimes I can't. And this time,
go all the way to the bottom where it's type message here, and there's a 2, and then so you can send it either to everybody or just to one person, but I'm just orienting you where I'm getting you to go. Next to that is a file, and I'm not sure what that means, but to the right of that, on my screen anyway, there's a circle with 3 dots in it. And if you click on that circle with the 3 dots, you get participant. Oh, wait a minute. What the hell?
It was there last weekend.
It was there last weekend.
I don't see it either.
I don't either. I wonder if that's set up when you set up the meeting. Oh, I bet it is. You know, there's
when you start recording.
I don't think it's when you start recording. I think it's when you set up the meeting. There's a million preferences in the Zoom preferences that you need to go to set up appropriately. And I believe there is a preference that says allow participants to save the chat. And this is apparently is not set.
I'll take
that
a look.
way.
They may have updated something and changed too.
Yeah, sorry about that. If that's true.
You can also go into the chat, Control A, Control C if you're on Windows, and copy it. Paste
oh.
WordPad or something.
Okay.
Editor. I've done that a bunch.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dan, for hosting that and putting all that hard work into doing that. Sounds just like a great resource. So thank you.
It's fun.
Yeah, at this point, I need to talk a little bit about the format of the meeting tonight. So Tom will be presenting, and while he's presenting, I'd like to ask everybody if you could please mute your microphones. You don't need to mute your video if you don't want to, but when Tom is presenting, we're going to have everybody mute mics. And then if you have questions for Tom throughout the presentation, please just go ahead and type those into the chat. And then Rick Chin, another one of our committee members and also our webmaster, Rick will be helping out with the moderation tonight. And so at certain times, Tom will take a break for questions, and then Rick will be moderating and looking at the chat and relaying your questions to Tom at the appropriate time. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Rick for helping put this meeting together. Thank you, Rick. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Rick because Rick is going to introduce Tom, and then Tom will take it away. Thanks.
Okay. I met Tom many years ago via the Ampex list, and it was uber cool to get to meet him. His father, Bob Fine, was one of my heroes a long time ago. So anyway, Tom Fine is the son of C. Robert Fine and Wilma Cozart Fine, the creators of the highly acclaimed Mercury Living Presence series of classical music recordings. Through the magic of Zoom, my dream of meeting him and getting him to present to us is coming true. Tom's a member of the Association of Recorded Sound Collections, the Audio Engineering Society, and the Adirondack 46ers. He operates an analog to digital transfer and mastering studio in Brewster, New York. Recent projects have included transferring 4-track quad recordings of BSO, transferring hundreds of oral history tapes for the state of New Mexico and Oregon State University, transfer and remaster work for audio used in a Netflix documentary about Nina Simone, and remastering for the new Mercury Living Presence box sets. Mr. Fine is a student of audio and recording history and has published articles and equipment reviews in the ARSC Journal and Tape Op magazine, as well as the AES Historical Community website and preservationsound.com. He also reviews music for Stereophile magazine, ARSC Journal, Tape Op magazine, and blackgrooves.org. He's also presented at several AES conventions and events. I give you my good friend, Tom Fine.
Thanks, Rick. Can everybody hear me well? Okay. Thanks, fellas. So I wrote down who I need to thank here. Thanks, Greg, for doing this and the committee. And Rick, thanks for the nice intro and our years of friendship. You're a good man. Also, Rick, it's Veterans Day. Thanks for your service, my friend. And all the other veterans here. And Dan Mortensen, thanks for hosting those TTTs on Saturday. Those are always fun. It's good to get together, even if it's virtual. We'll be able to get together in person, hoping to see some of you at least at AES New York next fall. So I'm going to put my slides on here and get going here. Just bear with me a second. Well, there we go. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a technical history of Mercury Living Presence more than a music or artistic history. There's a bunch of places to get more information on that, including the booklets from the CD box sets. But I'm happy to answer any questions along those lines during the question times. So we're going to talk about the key personnel. I want to get a little bit into the history of the label because there may be some younger people here who may not know like how an old school record label operated and how they started and that sort of thing. And we'll get into the gear and the evolution techniques. We'll talk about the recording truck, which was very important to these recordings. And we'll get into what's happening in the past decade or so and what's about to happen next year. So I guess the prehistory of Mercury Living Presence is the Mercury record label. Mercury was formed in the late 40s by Irving Green, Art Talmadge, and some partners. And those guys were jukebox operators in Chicagoland. And surprisingly, they were interested in all sorts of music, not just what they could put in their jukeboxes. So they started out as an R&B and jazz label, but soon after they started, they merged with John Hammond's Keynote Records. And you guys who know about Columbia Records know about John Hammond. And Hammond's Keynote Records had an interest in classical music because Hammond was a very patrician guy. He was a Vanderbilt heir, and he was interested very much in jazz. He's the guy who brought Billie Holiday to the recording studio, also Count Basie, but he was also interested in classical music. So Irving Green set up Hammond in New York and said, sure, let's do some classical music. So Hammond's connection with my father was that he had done recordings at Majestic Records sound studio in New York City. And my father was the engineer there after completing his service in the Marine Corps in World War II in the Pacific. So he and Hammond made recordings of Mildred Bailey and some other keynote artists, and also some records from Majestic. And Hammond made a recording of Stravinsky's piece Dumbarton Oaks with a pickup orchestra from the New York Philharmonic called the Dumbarton Oaks Orchestra. And that was an important recording because that was the first time my father used a single microphone to do a symphonic recording. Hammond, during his time at Mercury Records, hired a guy that you Columbia people know, Mitch Miller. And Mitch was the guy who I believe was the discoverer and the person who ushered in the 30th Street studio. So Mitch was at Mercury as an A&R guy, and also as an oboist. He made some recordings that my father made at Reeves Sound Studios. So this gets you up to about 1949 and the introduction of the LP. Now, when the LP came in, Mercury Records, through John Hammond, made a deal with the Czechoslovakia Ministry of Arts. And this was pre-communist Czechoslovakia. And one thing that they had was a festival after World War II called the Prague Spring. And recordings were made there by the Czech Ministry of Culture. And John Hammond licensed those recordings, plus a bunch of German orchestral recordings that were made by Telefunken during World War II. And the Czech Ministry of Culture had seized the master discs as war booty. So the master discs existed in Czechoslovakia, and they were issued on LP by Mercury. And that was Mercury's entry into the classical business. They also did some chamber music recordings at Reeves Sound Studio in New York, where my father worked from about 1948 to about 1951. And this picture here shows Mitch Miller. That's my father at the console. And this was a recording at Reeves. And this console at Reeves actually is pictured on a couple of Riverside records with Thelonious Monk, because those records were made at the same studio. So you get to 1950, and Mercury hired my mother, who was then a couple of years out of college, and they hired her to help out with quality control issues with these new LPs. And and very soon after that, John Hammond left to go to Vanguard Records. So she ended up kind of in charge of this classical music department that was having quality control problems with their LPs. And soon after, they lost a lawsuit with Capitol Records for the German recordings, because Capitol Records licensed copy discs that were still in Germany from Telefunken through the War Reparations Board, and made a claim that, hey, these are the legit recordings, and we made our deal through the War Reparations Board, and we're the legitimate owner of this in the United States market. And the courts sided with Capitol. So even though the recordings that Capitol had were inferior, they had the rights to issue that music in the United States. So all of a sudden, Mercury's left with a few original recordings and not much else of a classical division. So my mother said to Irving Green, well, we're at a time where the Chicago Symphony, your home orchestra, has a new conductor and no recording contract. So they went and negotiated a recording contract with the new conductor, Rafael Kubelik, and the Chicago Symphony. And in 1951, April, which will be 70 years ago this coming April, they went and made the first recordings there. And my mother ran the classical division at Mercury until 1964, when she retired to raise us kids. So my father was the recording engineer and the technical director for these recordings. He was never an employee of Mercury. He was always an independent contractor. He had his own studio, his own truck, and was always freelancing with Mercury and doing a whole bunch of other stuff in his career. My late friend and mentor, Bob Everens, was the associate recording engineer from the mid-50s onward. He went on the recording trips from 1958 onwards. Harold Lawrence was hired by my mother in 1956 and was the music director and tape editor during the stereo era. Claire Van Osdel was also a music director on some sessions. And when Philips bought Mercury, Philips launched its own classical label in this country. And Claire was the A&R man for classical at the Philips classical label. David Hall was the first recording director in the early mono era. And this is on an early session at Eastman School with the Eastman Wind Ensemble with Fred Fennell. And that's in an early iteration of the truck. The original LPs were mastered by George Piros. And in the era that there was stereo and mono product, John Johnson mastered the mono LPs. So now we get into the gear that was used to make these recordings. And I'll take a break after we get through the gear and we can do some questions if anyone has them at that point. The prehistory recordings, I call them, the early Mercury chamber music and the Dumbarton Oaks recording were made with a single Western Electric 640 condenser microphone. And this was a mic that was very, state of the art in the late 40s. You see that it has quite a presence boost, and that the whole point of the single mic technique is that you use the presence boost to pull the mic out a bit from the orchestra. And there's a point in the room where all the frequencies are hitting the mic at the right balance, and you're picking up the whole orchestra because you're a little bit out. It's usually over the conductor's head a certain number of feet, and anywhere from right over his head to a few feet back. But that seems to be the technique that usually worked with the single microphone, and it varied by the type of microphone and the hall. The Telefunken U47 microphone was introduced in this country in 1949. It was made by Neumann in Germany, but the exporter to the US was Telefunken. So the microphones that arrived here had a badge right here that was Telefunken, not Neumann. Reeves Studio in New York was one of the first buyers. My friend Rich Capeless, who's here, has talked about Rudy Van Gelder's studio was probably the second buyer in the New York area, or one of the early buyers. These mics, once the Americans found these microphones, they were very popular. You see that they have quite a presence peak, and they have very high sensitivity compared to the RCA and Western Electric ribbon mics that were typical at that time in recording situations. Now, my father liked this mic because for the single mic technique, it was more sensitive than the Western Electric, and it has a bit more of a presence boost. So you can actually pull it out a bit and still get the nice presence of the strings and the percussion, but also get a fuller picture of the orchestra and the hall. Furthermore, it's got a good omnidirectionalness to it. So if you're in a reverberant hall like Orchestra Hall in Chicago, the back of the mic picks up really nice hall tone, and you get quite an exciting recording that way. In 1952, the Schoeps M201 was introduced here, again under the Telefunken badge, and imported or exported by Telefunken. This microphone is even more sensitive and has a different presence boost, which makes it extra ideal for some of the single mic recording. It depended on the hall in the mono era. Some places my father used the U47 most of the time. Some places he used the M201 as soon as he got one. So it, really how you set this mic up and tune it and, place it exactly depends on the acoustics in the hall to a great extent. When the stereo era started, you have to remember that mono compatibility was absolutely vital because the mass medium was mono LPs. Until the mid 60s, the mass medium in the United States music market was mono LPs. You had to serve that market correctly. So what my father figured out was he tried out various 2 microphone stereo pickups, and he tried crossed matrix single point stereo and didn't like any of it. So what he figured out was if you space out 3 omnis, you really get a nice stereophony, and that center mic is still set up as the mono recording microphone. So you have complete mono compatibility as long as you bring a full track tape machine along. So the original left-right sides were U47s, but for a while in 1956, they used KM54s on the side. Now KM54s are cardioid. So it was not perfectly ideal for the wideness of the stereophony. And it's pretty interesting to listen to some of those early stereo recordings, because what they did was they would actually, they must have placed these microphones closer into the center. And when they mixed 3 to 2, they would not have the center as pronounced as it was with other microphones. So there's a different kind of stereophony. It's kind of a binauralness. And then the next thing was to use KM56s on the sides, and these in the omni position, and these worked better on the sides. But what my father really wanted to do was use 3 M201 microphones. And it took a few years. It took until 1959 because Shep stopped making the microphones and would not make any more, even when he asked them to. And he needed to acquire enough that you had extras, because if you go to England and you're recording, you have to have spares for everything. So it took him a while to get 6 microphones, but by the time he got 6 M201s, that became the standard setup. And that's the setup from about 1959 onwards. So this is the microphones timeline. And you could see that from the beginning of 59 onwards, which also coincided with the truck being rebuilt and the recording schedule really stepping up for a few years. They standardized on 3 M201s. They standardized on Ampex tape machines. They were standardized on audio tape, polyester back tape, and there was quite an improvement along the way in those early stereo years. So the first tape deck that was used in the mono era are these Fairchild tape machines. They actually have a closed loop system around the heads. So they actually have quite a stable tape path. And they were designed, they were in my father's truck because the truck was originally designed as a sound for picture recording truck. And these Fairchild machines are equipped with something called Fairchild Picsync, which was a way to synchronize camera and sound. And at times, Picsync was used during the early mono era because the power supply frequency or the power line frequency wasn't stable in some of the Midwestern cities. So my father would use Picsync to stabilize the power frequency. In the early stereo times, they experimented with what they called binaural, which was 2 microphone stereo. And a few of those recordings ended up being released in the very early stereo albums, but most of this was just experiments. And now it says my internet. Okay, my internet connection was said to be unstable. I hope that came across. anyways, the Ampex 2-track was used for these early stereo binaural experiments, and that would have been the 1954, 1955 timeline, but it stayed in the truck through 1956 because there's a couple of recordings where the 3-track machine didn't work, so they released the binaural tape as the stereo release. The 3-track machine was an Ampex 300, and apparently they had a very early one on the truck because throughout 1956 it gave them problems, and they eventually replaced it and then got a second 3-track as a backup. And the mono Ampex 300 was what replaced the Fairchild mono machines in 1958 when the truck was rebuilt. And then in 1960, in late 1960, my father bought what had been Everest Records recording studio in Queens. And Everest had pioneered recording album masters to 35 millimeter magnetic film. And at the time, the film offered an advantage of wider tracks, lower wow and flutter, and lower noise. So my father was quite keen on this because he did a lot of sound for picture work and was well familiar with magnetic film and its advantages over tape at the time. So Mercury started recording magnetic film in 1961 and continued until 1963. And it was they made a few dozen recordings this way, and it was definitely a good marketing peg. Now, I'll just suffice to say the film doesn't hold up as well as the tape. So in retrospect, it's a good thing they always ran a backup with 3-track tape. This is a picture of Bob Everens recording in Detroit in 1962. I saw Carrie Cornett online, and Carrie, you know that my father was good friends with Mr. Syracuse that owned the studio there in Detroit. Philips took over doing the European recordings in 1965 and 66, and Hans Lauterschlager, who's shown here, did a presentation about their M3, which was Mercury 3 microphone recordings. They did a bunch for Mercury in England, and they also did recordings of Philips artists in Holland and the UK. And they did a direct 3-to-2 mix on this mixer and recorded it to 2-track on a Philips tape machine. So, and Harold Lawrence produced those recordings for Mercury. And I highly recommend, somewhere Hans's presentation is available online. It's very interesting, and it's worth seeing. I think the audio is somewhere online too. Philips used the Schoeps MK23 microphone, which has a really pronounced presence peak. And so these recordings tended to be brighter than the typical Mercury recording. And they also move the mics out a little bit, so they tend to be a bit more reverberant, more European style, but they still sound Mercury-like. They still have that strong center and wide and high kind of stereophony. So this is just a summary that where you phase into the 3 mics. That 2-mic. The 2-mic binaural stage is interesting because they recorded binaural tapes at a lot of sessions, but only released a few because they had to, because the 3-track didn't work. So they just did not prefer that 2-mic technique. And I understand why when I listen to them, because it doesn't have the strong center that Mercury is known for. The microphone feeds always went directly to the tape machines, and usually through a bus of some sort, depending on the era of the truck. But there was not EQ or compression or anything like that. All the dynamics were controlled by the orchestra. And then the master tapes were always edited from first generation session tapes and the LPs were cut from those master tapes. So there's not a second generation cutting master on the original US releases. And that was another thing that stood out, because the tapes are very dynamic, and whatever tape hiss there is well below the surface noise of a 1950s and 60s LP. And this is a timeline of the recording firsts with the various microphones and a 35 millimeter and when the Philips engineers. The last session that was done with original team members was 1967 in San Antonio, but there were still recordings made under the Mercury Living Presence label until 1970. Some were engineered by Mark O'Bore, and a couple were engineered by George Piros at my father's studio. And some of those may see release soon. I'll talk about that later. And then finally, how do you get a 3-to-2 mix to an LP or a CD? Well, my mother would do it live during the mastering stage. And you got to remember that back in 1958 and through the early 60s, when George Piros was cutting these stereo LPs, this was a Scully lathe with a Westrex first generation stereo head and no preview system, no automation. So George would manually control the margin and the depth on the groove. You need to do this to fit a reasonable amount of time on a side. And some of these classical sides are 25 minutes long. So the way they did this was my mother would read ahead in the music score and give George hand signals to when it was getting quiet or when it was getting loud, so he could tighten or open up the margin to save what's called real estate on the disc. And that's my father at the lathe. But to truth in presentation, George did cut most of the LPs. So this is, my father did an interview with Burt White in Audio Magazine in the 60s. And this is his description of his cutting chain at that time. He did not use standard Westrex amplifiers, and he did not believe in much feedback on the cutter head, because he thought that stamped down dynamics. And basically that system that he had with those 200-watt Macintosh tube amplifiers, they could put a kilowatt into that cutter head. The reason the pre-emphasis was low pass is because they learned making command records with Enoch Light that those Westrex cutter heads will blow out pretty quickly if you put the thing they learned it with was Chinese bells on the album Persuasive Percussion, that if you send Chinese bells that were close mic'd through this system to a Westrex cutter head, it will burn out unless there's a low pass. So we get into remastering for compact disc, which my mother did from 1990 to 1999. And this is the setup at Polygram Studios in Edison, New Jersey. And she worked with a guy named Dennis Drake to set up the initial system. And again, she used her same 3-to-2 mixer, which is a modified Westrex mixer, and sent it directly to a DCS converter, and then right into the digital chain from there. So there was no DSP done. There was no limiting or EQ done on the way into the compact disc master. And this is these are some pictures of the Polygram Studios at that time. Things had changed since the 60s, because you see Dennis in shorts back there. But this is the digital equipment. There's a Harmonia Mundia digital bus with a Weiss dither down module. And the reason for that is that the DCS converter put out 24-bit, 44.1 kilohertz digital, and it needed to be brought down to 16-bit to be put into the Sony 1630 mastering system. And it's a real pity that there was no storage system for 24-bit audio in those days, because it came right off the tapes in 24-bit, but there was just no way to store it except in 16 bits. In the studio in New Jersey, my mother monitored on PNW 808 speakers, and I actually own this pair of speakers. They're up in my living room, and I use them in my mastering work all the time. They're fantastic speakers. My mother had equipment that was restored by Bob Everens for her. This is one of the 35mm tape machines. It had been modified quite a bit over the years. This thing on top, they called it the penthouse. That's there to accommodate these larger reels that are necessary for a full side of classical music. And the electronics were moved down below. These electronics used to be on a separate mixer preamp unit. They used an Ampex 300 for the half-inch tapes, and they used a Studer tape machine with a modified head block that fed the Ampex electronics for the quarter-inch tapes, because my mother did remaster a few mono quarter-inch albums and also a couple of the binaural recordings. So this is a letter that Dennis Drake sent describing the setup in the studio in Edison, New Jersey. And at this point, I'll take some questions.
Tom, can you talk a bit about your mother's musical training?
Sure. My mom grew up in Texas, came of age in Fort Worth. She moved there when she was a child from Mississippi, and went to what's called North Texas University now. In those days, it was North Texas State Teachers College. And she got a dual degree in music and business at the behest of her father, who did not figure that music was going to get her far in the world. So get a business degree just in case. And it actually served her very well, because she was a corporate vice president of Mercury Records, one of the few female corporate vice presidents in the 1950s.
Tom, did she play an instrument?
Yeah, my mom played keyboards. I think her major in college, or her emphasis, was organ, but she played piano all when we were kids. She'd sit and play the piano a lot.
Hey Tom, I'm curious. You mentioned about, with the 1 and then 3 mic techniques, that it was very important to kind of find a precise place in the hall, to get the best results. The question is what what did your dad do to figure out where that was in the various locations?
Well, I'll tell you, it's the way my mother described it is he could walk into a room and look around and have a pretty good idea to where to put a microphone. So he obviously knew how these microphones sounded, because microphones don't hear like your ears. Okay. So if you work with a microphone, you learn how it picks up sound and what it sounds like. They would tune it. He would guesstimate a place, and then they had it hung on ropes. So, you couldn't be way off, or you'd have to be climbing up and everything and hanging ropes and taking the time during a union orchestra session. So you had to have a pretty good first guess, but then they could fine tune it with moving it up or down and a little back and forth with the ropes. And when my mother was on the sessions, which was from 1953 onward, she was the final arbiter of the sound. But usually they came to agreement pretty quickly with it, is from the way they told it. I mean, they got married, so they couldn't have fought about it too badly.
Tom, did you ever attend any session with your mom or in recording?
I did attend a couple of the CD remastering sessions, because I wanted to understand the whole thing. I didn't get into it when I was explaining the equipment, but when she was brought out of retirement by Philips, it was really astounding what they did. They told her and Dennis Drake to take as long as they needed to find equipment that could make these CDs sound good. So they tested everything that was state of the art in 1988 and 89, and they weren't satisfied really. You know, the stock Sony 1600 1630 system wasn't going to do it. They tried it with the Apogee aftermarket reconstruction filters. That didn't do it. Then that DCS converter came out, and that came out right before they started remastering CDs. That was the answer. And the DCS converter was a unique thing that Philips came up with, a technology that is now called DSD, but in those days it was called bitstream. This idea of a very low bit, high sampling rate capture. And they licensed the technology to DCS, and DCS built this 900 model A to D converter. And that was the answer as far as being able to get something that sounded pretty much like what was coming off the 3-to-2 mixer. So yes, I did watch them do a couple of those. And as for the original recording sessions, my mother retired to raise the family, and I was born after she retired.
Tom, Rich Kaplis asks about the benefits of using 3-track versus just recording direct to stereo.
Well, they didn't have a monitoring situation that they were comfortable making a 3-to-2 mix on location. So they felt that they had more control over the final product if they did a 3-track recording, and then they could balance the center against the sides in a studio environment where they had a reliable monitoring situation. It would be like if you went today, today you might record 20 or 30 microphones in an orchestral session and then mix it. So it was just basically that. The Philips guys did a 3-to-2 mix. They were more comfortable with their monitoring situation, and they were just used to using multiple mics and mixing live to stereo. The European classical guys were comfortable with that. RCA and Columbia were comfortable with that. They always used a lot of microphones relative to Mercury on sessions, and did a live mix to their session masters.
It's quite interesting watching, the 3-mic thing, because Decca in particular used that tree system that they used, which didn't necessarily have to have the frame between it that everybody associates with a Decca tree. Quite often they were just on stands in that kind of relationship. It's interesting how the two very similar styles of music, shall we say, developed at either sides of the Atlantic, about the same times as well. And also they used Omni mics too, interestingly. Traditionally, Decca used Neumann M50s on the original Decca trees. But it's quite interesting just to see. And the reason they did it was so that they could do they didn't have the same problem monitoring when they were out recording in some church or big old building. They didn't have the monitoring set up, and that's the reason they did it, really.
Yeah. Well, Gordon, I always feel like Decca is the most similar to Mercury sounding of the classical labels in those days.
Very much so.
All right. We ready to move on? Any more questions? Yeah. Okay.
Steve Wilkins asks if the use of 35 millimeter film for audio recording was similar to the punk use of beta tape for audio recording.
I have no idea.
There's sure enough time between them.
Yeah.
And on the last slide, what are the dual stacked reels on the supply side of the tape machine?
On this one?
Yeah, it looks like there's
probably just, I don't know. Probably just
place to stash a reel.
A couple of extra reels.
Yeah. Let's see. How about some insight on the distance between the mics and the 3-mic array, and placing the center mic a bit forward a la Decca?
I think that usually with Mercury, that was not what they did. They would put the mics in an even plane, typically around the same height. But, I don't have any of the old notes. I'm just going on what Bob Everens and my mother and my father told me, that usually Bob Everens and I had a chance to really talk about this. And Bob ran a lot of sessions and set up the mics a lot of times. And, you know, he had a good memory. He said generally they would be in an even plane, about the same height, and the spread between the center and the sides really depended on how the orchestra was set up and where it was in the hall. What sort of a setup? Okay, if you're doing something that, you know, is a string ensemble, you're going to have the mics tighter in. If you're doing a huge orchestra with a lot of percussion, you're going to have the mics spread wider and perhaps further out. It really was set by ears, by hearing. And I guess I'd like to say that there's a formula for it, but there really isn't.
Were the three mics treated as two different arrays? In other words, the left and right being an AB stereo array and the center mic being mono?
No. They were the intent with the three microphones was that the center micro. Well, all right, let me put it this way. I think I understand the question. The way you would set this up at a session, everyone said, is you set up the center mic first. You have to get the mono recording. So you set up that center mic, make sure you're capturing the whole orchestra. Then you set up the sides. So the sides are in that plane. And the purpose of the sides is you're going to mix them in some ratio to the center, probably not at, there's probably going to be a mix. It's not going to be unity gain all the way across, but you're wanting to mix them so that you get width, depth, and height to the sound. And you're augmenting what the center mic is picking up to get the stereophony. And if you look on a phase scope, it's interesting, is because the phase of the stereophony, especially when you get in a reverberant hall like Watford in England, is random. And that's what a good classical recording sounds like. I've been working with these quad recordings with the Boston Symphony. It's completely random phase, but it sounds like you're right there in the hall. So you can't really go by a scope. You can't really go by the meters. You just have to kind of go by what it's going to sound right at some point if it's set up right.
Tom?
Yes.
A question. Did your dad ever get into rehearsals where he could test some of these mic spacings and positions and so on? Because I cribbed a lot from your dad's playbook, I can tell you. And I found one of the best things was to get into a rehearsal where you could go and actually fiddle around with stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, they would always get their, it was booked, it was part of the sessions that the orchestra would have rehearsal time because they needed setup time. And yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the conductor was always part of the deal with the recording, is that they would test during specific parts of the recording director, being my mother, usually would know the piece, would know what they were recording, and would know, what the contrast was between the different parts of the piece. And she would make sure that was covered in rehearsal so that they knew that it sounded right and it was going to get recorded right.
Tom, is there a list of the recordings that were two-channel originals?
The binaural ones? My mother was always very honest about this on the original CDs in the booklets. And I think the only two that were released on CD, there was one more that was never released on CD, but I'm just trying to think, because I've just been going through the stuff that wasn't released on CD and trying to figure out what's worth reissuing. And so the Bartók Suite for Orchestra #2, which was on the same CD as the Bartók Violin Concerto with Yehudi Menuhin. It was a binaural recording. And then I think there's one on one of the Paul Paray Detroit CDs that's from a binaural tape, and I think there's one Howard Hanson one that's from a binaural, one piece on one of the CDs. My memory is that binaural tapes ended up being released for about 3 or 4 LPs in 1956 from 1956 recordings, because those were there was one trip that they made to Rochester and Detroit where the 3-track recorder just was not behaving, apparently.
So by binaural, you mean 2-channel and not necessarily dummy head.
Yes, I mean, they called it binaural. It's 2 microphones. It's 2 spaced omnis is what it is, but they're 2, in my opinion, they're not as good as the 3 spaced omnis because there's kind of a hole in the center in comparison.
Hey, Tom.
Tom, forgive me if you covered this already, but was your dad's mobile truck, was that a complete oddity back then, or was it one of a number that were actually in use back then, to your knowledge?
The way the truck was specifically equipped, it was pretty novel in its time, but I'm going to get into the truck next, or either next or later in this presentation. Now I forgot where I am.
Hey, Tom, 2 things. One is, I guess, were you able to kind of discuss technical details with your dad much? And 2, was there any thought or experimentation on using the 3 mics to create a mono recording as opposed to just using the 1 mic?
Well, you can experiment with it. I've done it myself. It's terrible. There's a lot of cancellations because they're 3 spaced omnis. There's a lot of phase cancellations and weird reverb tails. And if you fold it down to mono, it's subtractive in that respect. And it's subtractive at different frequencies. It's almost a combing effect. Because there's different arrival times at different frequencies for each microphone, and different, transients are weird. It's the whole, okay, one good example is I remastered a couple of years ago the Henrik Shearing violin recordings. So Shearing would move when he was playing, and if you try to fold that down to mono, there's flanging. So it's always best to, it was definitely the wise thing to use the center as the mono and nothing else. Now, as for discussing the technical details, this was discussed somewhat when I was a kid. My father passed when I was 16, so I only had so much time to absorb so much, but I had a lot of time with my late friend and mentor, Bob Everens. And I asked him every question in the book, although I have to say, after he passed, I every time I work with this stuff, I'm like, damn it, why didn't I ask them this, or this? I have to kind of figure out stuff. But luckily, they once you learn how to read things like the tape logs and the session logs, and you listen to the tapes, things become clear as to what they were doing. You don't know exactly how they were doing it because you don't have diagrams or pictures, but you know what you need to know to make a good reissue. Let's put it that way. And my mother said the same thing when she was doing the CDs. She said, I don't remember exactly what was done on all these sessions. I can't tell you exactly what happened on these days, but we had good notes. And I know from the tape logs, because they were clear, they'd be clear, like, okay, so a recording that the 3-track machine wasn't working on, in the tape log, it would say that the master is a 2-track master. So then okay, on that day, don't even look for a 3-track tape. There's not going to be a 3-track tape for that day. So I don't know. Hopefully that answers the question. And we should move on because otherwise I'm going to be here till midnight my time. Are you guys ready for more?
That's the way it works. I have one more question for you.
Okay.
Do you know what the original monitors were? Were they 604s?
No, they took A7s on the road with them. And I don't have pictures of them set up with the A7s in the listening room, but usually what would happen is the recording director and the music director would be set up somewhere in the hall, usually in like the conductor's cloakroom or office or something, and they'd have 3 A7s. So they'd monitor in 3 channels, and they'd always monitor off the tape. After the microphones were set up, and once the recording began, they'd be monitoring off the tape. Now, one of the interesting things that my father and Bob Everens rigged up is they went down to the late great Radio Row and got a surplus telephone relay, a dial telephone relay. So they set up a system where my mother and Harold Lawrence could dial a code, and that would switch from the truck what was being assigned to the speakers. So, so that was pretty cool.
So what did they use in the truck for monitors?
3 Ampex 620s, which you'll see pictures of.
Okay.
And so let's move on. Let's talk about the truck. So the truck was built in 1952 by my father. In 1952, he left Reeves' studio and started his own company called Fine Sound. And it was in Tompkins Cove, which is in Rockland County, New York. And this truck was built with funding from a guy named Jerome Hill, who was an heir to the Great Northern Railroad and was a documentary filmmaker. And the whole purpose of this truck, which was originally called the Cinecruiser, was to take it to France and do the sound for the French part of Jerome Hill's documentary on Albert Schweitzer, which a lot of which entailed recording Dr. Schweitzer playing the organ in his native church in his village in France. And the truck did not go on the Africa portion of that movie. The movie is on YouTube, and it's quite an interesting documentary. If you don't know who Albert Schweitzer is, he was a great humanitarian, and you can look him up on Wikipedia. So the truck was originally built for film recording, but Jerome Hill was also a great fan of music, and said to my father, "Sure, use it for music recordings. We're not going to be using it for films all the time, so yeah, take it on the road and use it for the Mercury recordings." And Jerome generously gave the truck to my father in the late 50s. So the original layout of the truck, this is a Magnacorder mixer back here, and these are Fairchild 1/4-inch full track tape machines, and there's a bunch of other associated material in the rack. You saw that the truck towed a generator. That's a surplus military generator. That ended up not being reliable enough to be used on Mercury sessions. So there were all kinds of different iterations of the powering for the truck over the years. One interesting thing about recording in England is my father was a big believer that American equipment needed to run on 60 hertz. So instead of just having a voltage step-down transformer in England, they built what they called the power sled, which was an actual generator. It was an electric motor run off British power with a belt drive for an American power generator. And, they figured this all out with belt ratios or whatever. And basically they generated, and there was a huge flywheel on this thing. And basically this thing generated very stable 120 volts, 60 hertz power for the truck anywhere they were in England. And I think they took it to Europe too when they recorded in Vienna. I think when they recorded in Paris, the Marcel Dupré Sans Sulpice recordings that I remastered a few years ago, Bob Everens told me they used an Ampex 375 120 volts, 60 hertz power generator amplifier. And that was powered off the French mains and then regenerated for the truck. This is a view from the back, from the tailgate. So keep in mind, look at how clean and empty and well laid out it looks. This was the original monitor speaker with the first mono sessions. I don't even know what that was. It was probably a little Altec or something in there. So this is the mid 50s when we're getting into stereo. What's interesting here is there's a the 3-track machine is over here, the first one. This is the 2-track binaural machine, the portable Ampex 350. This is the 2 Fairchilds are still in the truck. Now these are 3 Ampex 620 speaker amps that are hung off the windshield when the truck is parked. Obviously not when driving. This is and this is the early stereo configuration. So the 1/2-inch transport is here, and then the 3 electronics are in this rack. And then this is now looking toward the back door of the truck, and this was when they had gone to there are 2 3-track machines now. So the portable binaural machine is gone, and so you have 1 3-track back here and 1 on the other side of my father. And look at all the wiring and everything. So by this time, this would have been around 1956, 1957. The truck was thoroughly kludged up. Well, no, it would have been early 58 because Bob Everens is there. So the truck is thoroughly kludged up at this point. And in 1958, during a break between Mercury sessions, my father said to Bob Everens, please rebuild the truck. So Bob was very proud of the job he did. There was no more of this hanging down into the doors and such. And this is, again, another look at how cluttered the truck got in the mid-50s. And this is after the 1958 rebuild. So one thing you'll notice is that the Fairchild machines are now gone. They've been replaced by Ampex 300 full tracks. Here's one of the 3 tracks. The other 3-track was across the truck. And all the electronics were in a rack. And then when they did the film recording, Bob Everens they took one of the 3-track machines out, and then Bob Everens built this assembly. Now, why do you have a mixer here? Because these Westrex film recorders, the recording preamps are in this mixer, and a low impedance signal is sent directly out of this box to the recording heads. The playback amplifiers are in the top of the unit behind here, but the recording amplifiers, preemphasis, and everything is in this box, and that goes right up to the recording head. There's no erase head on these things. You bulk erase the film. So on the road, you took the film you were going to record, and there was no going back on it. Hopefully you had enough. The truck went to Russia, to Moscow in 1962. This recording trip was the first time an American record label was allowed to go to the Soviet Union and record Soviet artists in their native venues. And so the first thing that Bob Everens told me, the first thing that happened is the truck was sent to Russia by train, and it arrived, or no, it was shipped from Holland, but then it got on a train at one of the Black Sea ports and ended up in a train yard in Moscow. So they go to pick it up, and the first thing my father did was drive it into Red Square, which this police officer was not happy that he was parked in front of the church there. But look, all the Russians were very surprised to look at an American truck right there in Red Square. This is it parked at the Tchaikovsky Conservatory. And my mother's there. And this truck here was the Balalaika Orchestra that they recorded. That was their equipment truck. And that was an interesting story because there was a lot of negotiations. One of the things they were very eager to do was record native Russian folk music in Russia. And one of the things the Ministry of Culture kept dangling back and forth was whether the Balalaika Orchestra would show up. And so they showed up at the Tchaikovsky Conservatory planning to record some patch-up things for their session from the previous night. And then this truck pulls up and the Balalaika guys pull out and So that was what that day was taken up with. And they were the people, all of the crew that did that session, my parents and Bob Everens, and also Harold Lawrence and Bryce Summers, who was the Mercury's European guy. Anytime that they ever talked about that, that was a highlight in their life, because just the idea that these guys showed up and just started playing and calling out tunes, and Harold was trying to keep a take sheet and have the translator say what the tune was, and this sort of thing. And it ended up being quite an experience. So the truck was also used to record the 2-volume Civil War albums, and they recorded original weaponry at West Point. Now, these are the Altec A7 monitors that they took on the road to listen. And it's interesting. I think this was set up for a picture, but I wonder if they were doing their monitoring out in free air like that. That would be interesting. The weapons were probably being fired somewhere off in the distance. And I think at West Point, they were recording everything for that. So that was everything from big cannon to Parrott guns, which were rifled cannons, to small arms fire. They went to Gettysburg to record marching soldiers and horses, and to recreate Pickett's charge for the albums. So the truck, this is basically the details on it. It was it put in a lot of miles. A guy who lived near my father in Rockland County named Bill Decker drove it to most of these places. So, and Bill took a lot of pictures also over the years. So it was finally retired in the mid 60s, and Bob Everens lived in Oradell, New Jersey. So he saw to it that the Explorer Scouts that worked with the Oradell Fire Department got it. And it was last seen behind the Oradell Firehouse in the early 70s. Any questions on the truck?
Did Mercury put any money into it to get their name on the truck?
So the whole financial arrangement on the truck is, Mercury. So Mercury owned the first 3-track, and so when that was offloaded from the truck, that was in the Mercury offices on Fifth Avenue, and that's what Harold Lawrence did his tape editing on. I think Mercury paid for some of the equipment in the truck, but the truck was owned by my father, and most of the equipment lived at Fine Recording.
Yeah, it was just interesting that the Mercury logo was on the side in those Russia pictures.
Well, I think my father was proud to have it on the truck. I actually have that logo sign. Bob Everens kept it off the truck. I also have the British license plates for the truck. The truck was dual license, so it could be driven all around England. And it was I think my father had a very he was married to the VP, and he had a very healthy business relationship with Mercury, so I think he was happy to put the sign on the side. Notice it said Fine Recording too.
Why didn't the Russians record the material that your dad went over to record?
Well, they did record Russian music, and it was released. A lot of it was released through EMI from their Melodia label. But this was a culture. So there was a little bit of thawing of things in the early 60s. Of course, we also had the Cuban Missile Crisis, but under Khrushchev, there was a little bit of thawing, and there was some cultural exchanging. So one thing is that Byron Janis, who was a Mercury artist, the pianist, was very popular in Russia, just beloved by the Russians. And he had toured the Soviet Union, and that was kind of the entree to letting an American company in. They also wanted to look at what we were doing. They wanted to know how Mercury did it. Believe me, they took everything apart before it went back on the ship to come home. Every single thing was taken apart and photographed. and everyone was spied on all the time. There were monitors all over the place. The funny story about the tapes is that the master tapes is that Harold Lawrence had bought new luggage. Bob Everens told me this story. He just always loved telling this. Harold Lawrence had bought new luggage for the trip and was very proud of this new luggage that he had bought. And so my mother and Bryce Summers were basically trapped in a room endlessly negotiating with Ministry of Culture people. And the Ministry of Culture people were threatening to embargo these tapes and seize them. So my father and Bob Everens said to Harold, you got to give us these suitcases. And they loaded all the tapes in the suitcases and gave them to the CBS News man who had been covering the recording trip and was going back because the media had diplomatic passports. So his luggage was never searched at the airport, and he could fly these tapes back to New York and deliver them to Fine Recording.
I was going to make a side comment. I have some pressings from the Soviet Union of that era, and they sound like crap. So whatever Mercury could do, did it much better than the Soviet Union would have.
Yeah, they were kind of primitive. They had a lot of German equipment. They had Telefunken and Studer equipment in their studios. They got much better. Like Bob Everens went on in the 70s. He was president of Magnatech Film Equipment, and he did a huge deal with the Soviet film, the Ministry of whatever that ran the state-owned film industry there. And so by the 70s, the Soviets got much more serious about upgrading things and being more, they used kind of an American model with how they did sound for picture, but they did a more European model on how they did recording always. So
move on.
Yes. All right. So now I wanted to put this slide because this was, my mother summed up the philosophy of what she was trying to get at as the producer and, in charge of these recordings. And, what they were all about was setting up these microphones and enabling the orchestra and the conductor to do their thing and capturing that in a way that it wasn't really a documentary capture or like a broadcast style capture. It was made to be played and listened to over and over. So it was definitely a produced recording, but they didn't want to get in the studio and do a bunch of production to the sound. They had no qualms. Like Harold Lawrence was a king of the blade and the splicing block and the razor blade. So, those recordings that you listen to on a record, every single note in that was the best that they have out of all the takes that they did. And they would redo things until they had a good take. But as far as the capture of the sound, they wanted to put you in the hall, and they wanted the conductor and the orchestra to control the dynamics and the kind of the inner details of the whole thing. And that 3-mic technique, actually, I have a creaky chair here, so if you hear weird noises, it's not my stomach, it's the chair. Anyways, the 3-mic technique really lets you listen into the score. That's one of the benefits of it, because there's kind of an intimacy to the sound, and yet you're also picking up the hall and the size of the hall. So I think that's the point, is what they were shooting for. It should be an experience like you're actually there. So the releases, the way these recordings were released were mono LPs and then stereo LPs after stereo came along. There were stereo reel-to-reel 2-track tapes in 1956, but this was a niche market. These things basically cost the equivalent of about $30 today, and they were less than an LP length. So, these were not something that were a mass market. The stereo LP itself was a niche market until the mid 60s, but they always, they would edit a stereo and a mono master always, and always for many years, even though they were making these wonderful stereo records that were really pushing the state of the art of cutting a stereo record in the early years, the thing that would actually pay the bills would be the mono LP. And one thing that happened when my mother did the CD reissues is she got a lot of letters from people who were hearing this in stereo for the first time, like they had grown up with the mono LPs. The LPs were originally pressed by RCA because my mother didn't feel Mercury's plants were capable of pressing a quiet enough LP, which was true. When Philips Records acquired Mercury in '61, they moved the pressing to their plant in Richmond, Indiana, and the pressing quality went from worse to much worse as the '60s went on. RCA, of course, went to the paper thin record by the '60s, so everybody's pressing got terrible by the end of the '60s. Mercury Golden imports were reissues that were produced by Philips after everyone else, after the original people had all left Mercury. Some of them, it's an interesting thing because I've now that I see the tapes more and have access to the vault, some of the golden imports were cut directly from 2-track mix, 3-2 mixes that my mother made when the LPs were cut. Some of them they went back and made new 3-2 mixes. So they don't really sound Mercury-like. Some of them sound better than others. The vinyl is definitely absolutely much better. It's as good as the RCA vinyl. Philips tended to cut at a lower level. It's the European records are always cut at a lower level. It's just a thing. Americans cut LPs louder than Europeans do. It's how it always was. So my mom was hired to produce the CDs. She ended up doing about 150 album reissues on 125 CDs. And then by 2010, all of those pretty much were out of print, the single issue CDs. So then we get into the modern era. What happened is Philips owned a company called Polygram, which merged with a company called MCA Universal to form the modern Universal Music Group. And in that transition period, there was a lot of stuff that went out of print. And the classical division kind of bounced around a bit. It ended up being run under what's called Decca Classics in the UK, except for Deutsche Grammophon, which is still its own operation in Germany. So Mercury ended up under Decca Classics in the UK. It had been under Philips Classics in Holland. And the Decca people started paying more attention to it in the last 10 years. So the first thing they did was take all of my mother's CDs and reissue them in 3 box sets. So this is box set 1 and box set 2. And then now box set 3, which I was more heavily involved in, we went back and remastered some stuff. And we also issued some stuff on CD for the first time. And then I was hired to remaster all of the Marcel Dupré recordings, which were reissued in their own box set. And that was partially funded by the Marcel Dupré Appreciation Society in France. And then in 2018, Decca Classics reissued the Henrik Schiering recordings, and I remastered all of the Mercury and 2 of the Philips recordings in that box. So box set 1 was actually released originally out of the Hong Kong division, because there was demand for the CDs were out of print. And some of you might know that Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore are actually still big CD markets for classical music. And so there was a demand for certain titles. So the folks in Hong Kong put together box set 1, and they used as the booklet a reprint of this product, which is called You Are There, which was a sampler CD and a booklet. You can see there's a book here and there. This was called a Compactotech, and these things were big in Europe in the 90s. But this book, the booklet is interesting. If you ever can get your hands on one of those on eBay, they tend to go cheap. And the booklet is interesting because that's a first person account of everything written by my mother and Harold Lawrence and some of the original artists. So that's the only place that has a first person account of this. The box set 2 was in 2013, and then box set 3, we had all of the 1990s CDs plus 12 newly mastered, 10 of which were new to CD, and that was all in print for a while, including after the Dupre box set was out. So in the 2015-2016 time frame, more of the Mercury catalog was in print at the same time than ever before. As everybody knows, the CD is a submerging medium, and we're all going to streaming now. So the box sets are now pretty much out of inventory, and the Shearing box set, it had a weird release. It was not available very much in this country, and I keep asking why. But if you go to Amazon US, it's hard to get the thing. So I don't really know. All of that stuff is going to end up streaming. The box set 3 masters were made, the majority of them were done by Andy Walter at Abbey Road Studios using transfers that he did, and also that were done by a German company called Avarto. And then the ones that I did, we did new transfers from the 3-track tapes with plangent process, which you guys might know about that. This is a method where they capture the bias signal and then time align to the bias signal. So you're getting rid of all the wow and flutter. I really like working with that. It's always a matter of budget and a matter of if they'll send the tapes over here for us to work with. But when there's budget and when I can get the tapes, I prefer to work that way for digital releases. The Copeland third that was in box set 3 was a real basket case mono tape, but we ended up getting a fantastic reissue out of that because Plangent was able to save a wow problem on the recording machine, and I love the way that ended up. That sounds really good. And then I was happy with the stereos I did too on that one. The Dupre box set, I'm really happy how that one turned out. And the Shearing box set, I think we tried, we keep pushing the state of the art with this. So with the Shearing box set, everything from the tape head onward was done digitally. So we didn't use any tape electronics. The NAB, EQ, and everything else was done digitally on the Shearing. And I like how it turned out. I probably would go back to using the plangent electronics in the future because I actually think it's easier to just work with getting an analog signal off the electronics, but for various reasons. But in any case, I'm happy with how those turned out. Now, the other interesting thing is we have an AAA, meaning all analog issues going on too. I remastered for LP some recordings for Chad Kassem's Analog Productions label. And so what happened is we got the 3-track tapes over here and I cleaned them up so that, for an LP, the tape has to play the whole way through. So all those splices have to work and the thing has to go through the heads correctly. It has to go through, in this case, an Ampex ATR 100 transfer with no problem. So, splices all need to be the right height. Splices can't bind or grab or anything. And we did that at Sterling Sound in Nashville. I worked with Ryan Smith. And this was my first time working on LPs where I was actually there at the cutting. And it was quite, that was a fun time. That was a really nice, good trip. I hope we do more because that I really enjoyed. This is what the Starker LPs look like. And this is Ryan's studio. It was brand new in Nashville then. Sterling Sound used to be in New York. They used to own the top floor of Chelsea Piers, and it turns out they had an opportunity to own the building or be an investor in the building, and they didn't. So when their lease ran out, their space was worth a couple of $1 million. So they didn't want to lease it for that. So they ended up, Ryan Smith and Ted Jensen moved to Nashville and set up Sterling Sound Nashville. And the other guys set up in New Jersey. So Ryan's studio, these are ATC monitors that are built into this glass wall. And there's an airlock behind them in the wall, which is pretty interesting. And then you look out, there's a hallway back there, and then that looks out to the street. And it's kind of funny because there's a dog park across the street. So it was always funny watching the dogs over there while we were cutting LPs. Ryan has, this is an Ampex ATR 100. And if you notice, this is a custom preview system for the lathe. So he can cut AAA with the lathe automation from an ATR 100. Now, what we used was this ATR 100, which was fitted with a 3-track head. And we used ATR Services transformerless electronics. And then Ryan has a 3-to-2 mixer that Muth, the guy that works on the lathes, built for him. Dangerous Music Equipment, that guy, Chris Muth, built this for him. That it's passive on the sides and you're controlling the center with it. So it has a very short circuit path. And if we needed to balance the sides, we had to control the output on the tape machine. It's not exactly what I would have liked, but we got a nice mix, so I'm not complaining. Now, the way we did this is for those Starker Bach solo suite sides, Ryan would just use fixed pitch because the sides were short, and so they'd cut directly from mine and Ryan's 3-to-2 mix to the lathe. Now for the Dvorak cello concerto, what we did was we put on the screen here a waveform from my mother's CD, and I hit play when he started the lathe, and that way he could look at the waveform. And that was the same thing as my mother reading ahead in the score and giving George Piros hand signals about when to open up the margin or close the margin to save real estate. So that worked quite well. We were able to get the Dvorak cut in just 2 tries. Here's another look at Ryan at the lathe. That's a Neumann VMS 80 lathe with their last generation cutter head. And the automation stuff is over here, but we didn't use any of it. This is the ATR tape machine with the ATR Services electronics. So now here's my news, and we're getting toward the end of this. We're relaunching the label for the 21st century. We're meaning Universal Music, and they've hired me as a consultant to work on this. So the emphasis is going to be on digital only releases for streaming, but everything's going to be mastered in a way that it can be going out on physical media if a market wants it. So we're doing 192/24 mastering on everything. It can be sold as high res downloads. It can be sold as regular res downloads. It can stream high res. It can stream lossy. It can be mastered for CD. It can be cut to LP, whatever people want. Hell, if they want cassettes, we'll do cassettes for them, because that's the market today. There's going to be a new website and a Facebook presence. And April 2021 is the 70th anniversary of the label. So there are celebrations planned. So I put a slide in about how you can listen to this today. it's pretty hard to get physical CDs anymore. Most of the inventory is sold out, and there's, Universal doesn't own CD plants anymore. This is not something they're eager to get into doing. They will if there's demand in a market. Like, they reprinted box set 1. I think they ended up printing like a couple of 100,000 copies of that worldwide because there was a lot of demand for that. Box set 2, it was a little bit less, and box set 3 was a little bit less than that. But right now there's no standing order in any market to go and reprint all these CDs. So the place to find it is on streaming these days. Now, it's a little bit hard to find on streaming because all of it's not up there yet. But that's one of the things we're working on. We're hoping by first quarter 2021, every single thing that's been released under the Mercury Living Presence label is going to be on all the major streaming services, and you're going to be able to find it searching easily. So this is a whole thing. You have to work with the algorithms on the streaming services. You have to work with the metadata, et cetera, but we have people doing this. There are experts, and I'm not one of them. There will be more news, so stand by. And with that, I'll take questions.
Hey, Tom,
do we have a copy of the NPR 1996 interview with your mom that can be listened to anywhere?
Now, I thought it was on NPR's website, but the last time I looked, the audio was not streamable. They have a lot of, unless I think it was in real audio format, which I don't have anything that can play. So if anyone has real audio capability, I think you search on the NPR website, search on Wilma Cozart Fine, and I think it was Leanne Hanson who interviewed her.
Tom, wasn't there an interview with your mother on one of the box sets?
Yeah, that was an in-house interview that was done by Sedgwick Clark, who edited the booklets, and that was done in it was part of the press kit for the mono releases. So it talks a lot about the mono stuff, but not as much about the overall label. And the Hong Kong people put that in box set 1 as a bonus disc.
Was there anything like that in the You Are There compilation?
No, the You Are There was a book. The booklet had a lot of text by my mother, but the CD is just musical tracks.
Now, Tom, did you get the interview with your mother with Bruce Duffy from WNIB too?
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
That was good. That was done by Mary Jo, who ended up working in promotions at Polygram in the 90s. So Mary Jo ended up promoting a lot of those CDs in the US market.
Hey, Tom, regarding the 3-2 mixing, of course, there's that famous photo of your mom with the Westrix mixer. One, was that just levels, or was there also like EQ? And in real life terms, how much kind of active mixing was there, or was it pretty much set it and forget it?
No, it was active. There was not EQ on the mixer, but here's the interesting thing. Because of tubes and the vagaries of tubes, that mixer actually splits the center and sends it to both sides. So there's a fader for left center and right center and left and right. So the way my mother always, I also saw this in New Jersey. Depending on the tape, depending on how the equipment was behaving, usually the two center faders were at the same level. Sometimes one was a little higher than the other, but her thing was she'd first get the center dead center as she heard it, and then she would build the sides off the center. And the way I do it is I mix in the box, and I don't have the vagaries of that, so the center track is just panned to the center. And but I get the center. I listen to the center for a while to get a feeling for how the orchestra's playing and how the hall sounds. and then I build the sides up where I want to feel like the center is, there comes a time where the sound is either convex or concave, and you don't want it to be either one. You want it to be uniform, like just big and wide and deep and high. So there's a time where the sides balance to the center, and you know it when you hear it, is basically the only way I can explain it. It really depends on every tape and every piece of music. And so I've mixed stuff from Sans-Sulpice. I've mixed stuff from Ford Auditorium in Detroit. I've mixed stuff from Northrop Auditorium in Minneapolis, and I've mixed stuff from Watford in England. And every single mix is a little bit different. You really just you understand the sound. You can, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just like I've listened to the CDs and the LPs enough to understand what it's supposed to sound like, and then I just what I have at my disposal with the modern transfers is I have less noise and a wider frequency range, and just less basic hash. One thing that I've not done is gone back and used the vintage equipment. I just feel like, that time is past. We're in a new time. The sound that people listen to is different today. And I'm more interested in what the microphones picked up. And I'm interested in what that performance sounded like. So I'm trying to take away the stuff between the microphones and the listener and just make it as clear and transparent as possible, which I think is what, if you're doing a good job with classical recording today in digital, that's what you're doing. You have at your disposal better clarity and better detail than you've ever had. Hopefully that answers that question.
So do you use much EQ then, Tom, or do you just leave it pretty much flat and use the levels to balance it out?
I don't use much EQ at all. I might do a nip or a tuck here or there, but very little.
I'm just amazed how similar, as you know, I've said before that, I got quite involved in classical radio broadcasts with the BBC here. It's so similar. I know it's slightly different levels and maybe not quite so in your face, some of the recording stuff that you hear from Europe in the classical world, but just the techniques are just so similar, because I was lucky enough to meet some of the older dudes, people probably of your dad's generation, who before they actually retired, and that's the way they did it, you know what I mean? And it's how, if given a chance, I'll do it as well, because it's how it was shown, and I'm not really that adventurous when it comes to trying new things. If it works, it stays working,
Yeah. Well, Gordon, I think I don't understand why it evolved to there's so many microphones involved in recording a good orchestra in a good acoustic space. I don't know why it's necessary, I think you can use these older simple techniques and get quite a good recording. I wrote an article for Tape Op. I told young recordists, use one microphone on everything. Figure out how to record everything that you want to record with one microphone. Then figure out how to make a good mono mix. Then start using a bunch of microphones and a bunch of tracks and a bunch of effects and this and that. Learn how a microphone sounds.
On an orchestra or a drum kit.
Yes.
Anything that's got large acoustic space around about it, frankly.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
I like to point out that you've got two ears, but only one voice. That would justify the three. And then if you've got an orchestra plus soloist, why are you splitting the soloist off to two speakers when it should be coming in one point? But
yeah. Well, I did a presentation a few years ago at the AES where I traced the history of mic techniques, mainly with American recordings. And, we got up to the 70s where Andy Kasdan at Columbia was using 30 microphones. And, that's That's a lot of microphones for an orchestra.
You know, I think some of it comes down to CYA. The orchestra costs you N dollars per second, and you just want to make sure you've got everything there to capture it, and you don't have to use all the microphones.
Yeah.
But if you didn't capture them and then you need them later, then you're SOL.
Mm-hmm.
Since you do have a center channel, has there been a consideration of extending that to try and do surround mixes?
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of interested in this, in the whole thing. So you know that Universal through Abbey Road Studios is very interested in Dolby Atmos for music. So you know, I've said to them, hey, let's take some of the 3-track tapes and see what we can do. You know, I'm even interested. Let's take some modern full range speakers and play these 3-track tapes in Watford Hall and record new Atmos recordings there. I don't know if it would work or not. Let's try it.
It's worth a try.
I would point out here in Portland, Oregon, the sound mirror, when they record the Oregon Symphony, they have 32 microphones hanging around the stage. But I was told by their engineer, John Newton, that there were 5 across the front that did most of the work, and the rest of them were just to bring out the details when they needed them.
Yeah, yeah.
The BBC proms in recent years have started to breed microphones all over the top of the orchestra. I mean, back in even as late as the early mid-90s, they were only using 3 or 4 microphones. But lately they've got loads of them, and the main reason for that is when they've got the TV now, the television is such a big thing of the proms in the UK now. It used to just purely be radio, but these days the TV, and they actually use those mics to emphasize when they're zooming in on a section of the orchestra. The audio, the TV audio balancer will bring it up, you know, to kind of just emphasize where he's looking at. You know, if he's focused in on, say, the woodwind or something like that, they'll you know, just a tiny amount, but enough. They'll bring the woodwind up a little bit and things like that. But the actual radio broadcast is still the 4 mics around the arc at the front, basically, with one halfway back in the hall. You know, despite all the new treatments they've done in the Albert Hall, that trick appears to still work. And I also have been there when they've used purely one sound field microphone for the radio broadcast.
Yeah,
which is the 5 channels from that.
Well, the sound field thing's interesting in and of itself. That was a great presentation.
I've just got a new one which I'm going to start playing with. I'll let you. I'll see if I can get something recorded and let you hear it.
Yeah, cool. Well, anybody else?
I mean, if you want the traditional. Sorry, Gene, on you go.
Hey, Tom, I just wanted to say, hey, as a photographer, you guys have to excuse me, I'm just a photographer, but this has been most wonderful listening to my old buddy Tom talk about all this stuff. I've enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Gino.
Tom, I have a question.
Yeah, Rich.
Is there a website that's really good at and dedicated to Mercury Living Presence where I could learn more about the catalog?
Well, hopefully we're going to have it built pretty soon as part of this kind of modernizing relaunch thing next year. Meantime, I could send you the booklets to the box set PDFs.
Sounds good.
Tom, did your father ever use spot mics for soloists?
He didn't, but Bob Everens did it with the in the '67 session with the Romeros.
Oh yeah.
Playing with the San Antonio Symphony.
Yep.
It's just you needed a spot mic on guitars in front of a symphony orchestra. So he used a 4th M201 on the guitars. And it was so it was lower. And the way what he say, it was lower and it was not, it was blended, you know, at a lower level than the main center mic, and it was fed to the center track.
All right, Tom, I think you can start part 2 now. But seriously though, I'm curious, how did your dad's remote work differ from his studio work?
What do you mean?
In terms of technique?
I don't, well, okay, so if there were some Mercury stuff recorded at Fine Recording, and that was usually done with three omnidirectional microphones in the big ballroom studio, so it was similar. So I guess the technique was pretty much the same. It just, obviously you'd set up differently at Fine Recording. For instance, Rafael Puyana doing solo harpsichord is going to be a very different setup than, well, so those Janos Starker, the Bach solo suites, which that recording has sold an incredible amount. I come to find out, the Decca people told me that has been in print in one form or another since it came out in 1966, and it still is popular with streaming. So my own opinion on it is, having now remastered it over 2 days, I've heard all the solo cello I need to hear for a while, but it is fantastic. So the way that was originally released and the way my mother did it for CD, they spread it out more like it was an orchestra. And what Ryan Smith and I did on these LPs, which we've gotten some good, really good reviews about, is what I heard on the tapes is, this is incredibly physical music. This is a big guy with a cello really attacking some physical music, and it feels physical. So what I wanted to do was, instead of having this big wide reverberant thing, I wanted it more focused. So I guess my mix would be more center and less sides, and a bit less room, because I want you to hear this guy leaning in and attacking Bach with fervor. And people who have I've gotten some notes from some people who have the original LPs, they bought the CDs, they bought the German SACD, and they bought this, and they feel like this puts you in the room with Starker more. It feels like there's a man in front of you, a big guy playing a cello very physically. So, I guess back to your question, that the technique would have been similar in whatever venue, but like with my father's studio work for pop music or something, it was a totally different technique. It was like microphones really close, things cut really loud, like everything was in the 60s.
The Starker CD is one of my favorite classical CDs. I really love it.
Oh, cool.
And that is the advantage of having the center mic, isn't it? You can change that.
Exactly.
The thing you did. I used a lot of MS mics. I've talked to this before, like mid-side, and you can achieve similar results with that. Maybe not across a full orchestra, but certainly, with a group or a solo artist, you can achieve that kind of effect as well. You can go back to it again, go maybe a little bit less side on that, or maybe a little bit more reverb on it, or whatever, without actually doing any more than moving sliders around.
Yeah, I agree. I like mid-side in general. I think Telarc kind of they did recordings most similar to Mercury because those guys were big fans of the Mercury stuff. In fact, they made their bones with a Fred Fennell recording. So they even got the Mercury artists, but they ended up doing a dummy head in the middle instead of a microphone. And they always got good recordings. Jack Renner was a good engineer.
Tom, I thought you might be interested that a number of years ago, I set up a minimalist recording kit that I could take out in the back seat of my car to a recording session at a small hall of a 105-piece symphony orchestra here in Toronto. And I used an MS mic, recorded it directly to DAT, believe it or not, DAT audio.
Wow.
Brought it back home, loaded it into a workstation, mixed it, had the conductor come in to listen to some of it. I was playing some of it as he walked in. And his comment was, he says, "Is that us?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "We sound good." So I gotta say, MS, minimalist, worked like gangbusters for me. I'm not doing it anymore for a variety of reasons, but I had a lot of fun doing it and recorded some great music doing it also. And like I said earlier, I cribbed a lot out of your father's playbook. No food.
Well, Graham, I got to say, first of all, it's nice seeing your face. I hope you're doing well. And yeah, MS is a good technique. I think it's even better today because the mics are more sensitive, the preamps are better, and there's not a noise floor with digital recording. You can really mess with it.
I used a pair of Audio Technica 4050s set up in MS configuration on the top of a huge pole about 5 feet above the conductor's head and a couple of feet from his back towards the audience. And I got spectacular results.
Yeah.
So that just confirms what you've been talking about this evening. It works.
Yeah, simple works.
Yep. Keep it simple.
Well, I was going to relate. I do have a personal experience with Janos Starker. I was invited to record him here in Portland with his student Hamilton Chaffetz for National Public Radio's Performance Today some years ago. And so I've compared what I did with some of your Mercury things, and just to see if we agreed on them. I used a pair of TLM 170s hung above the stage at Portland State University when I did that. So
neat. Yeah, he was he was quite the cellist. He taught a lot of cellists too, because he was an instructor at Indiana University for decades.
Well, that's where Hamilton Chaffetz went, and I'd also recorded one of his other students. What's the guy's name? From the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and so that's been my experience from the teacher-student standpoint. Mr. Rothman of the LA Philharmonic.
Neat.
Tom, did any of your people relay anything about when they worked with Starker, his personality? I know when he worked with my dad, he played the Dvorak with my dad's orchestra. He was really quite a character, pretty much it seemed a chain smoker.
Yep.
Hardly dodged opinions, highly opinionated fellow.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a spicy Hungarian for sure. Yeah, he liked to drink, he liked to smoke.
Yep.
He was a physical guy, you know, he lived. And you know, I think that's why people like his art so much, is because he was very human. So, you know, he put this humanity into the music. And you know, that it's difficult, like those Bach cello suites. You know, that's you're basically naked there. It's you and a cello, and you're either going to pull it off or you're not going to pull it off. And he pulled it off quite well.
They had tremendous influence on the cello community and outside the cello community, obviously.
Yeah. Well, he got brought over here by Dorati, who was a fellow Hungarian. And in fact, my mother was the first American he met when he got off the plane. because she was working when she was first out of college. She worked for Dorati at the Dallas Symphony, and so she was sent to pick up Starker at the airport when he came here to. He was a cellist with Dorati for a while when he first got here.
I think it was with Chicago for a short while too.
Yeah. Yep. All right, guys, are we about wrapped up?
Great meeting, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm glad
Thank
this
you very
happened.
much. Thank you very much, Tom. We've enjoyed it. I certainly have.
Yeah, this was fun. It was nice to see all the people from the Ampex list, and my Saturday TTT crowd and AES people. A few of my old buddies showed up who aren't even recording people, like my buddy Gino.
This is the first time that I've ever tried this Zoom or anything. I got a brief explanation of how it worked a couple of nights ago, and I'm amazed that I was able to work it as well as I did. And I want to thank you very much for this. I hope you do it again, because you're talking my language.
Well, we'll do something. I'm hoping AES 2021, fingers crossed, in-person meeting in New York. I got a big thing I want to do on the history of quad, and I want to do a quadraphonic playback session. How's it going,
cool.
Jerry?
Going good. Good to see you again.
Yep, you too.
It's been a good session.
Thank you. Thank you.
A
Yeah,
lot of good, clear explanations of the history of it.
thanks. It's nice to see everybody. I'm glad everybody's healthy.
Yeah.
This
No
shit'll be
kidding.
over soon.
I hope so.
Yep.
Fingers crossed.
Yep.
Mask
Fingers
up.
crossed. All right, everybody. Best to you all.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Tom.
definitely.
Thank you, Tom.
Definitely.
Thanks, Tom.
See ya.
Thanks, Tom. See ya.